a man at the absolute peak of the world, with a billion-dollar company and a portfolio of homes that spanned continents. To his adoring public, Connor Reeves was a visionary. But to his pregnant wife Lauren, in the sterile silence of their glass penthouse, he was a stranger. He had just told her that the woman who had stood by him through poverty, the woman carrying his first child, was now a liability. She was too ordinary for the life he was building. He thought he was closing a chapter neatly excising his past. He had no idea she was about to write an ending he never saw coming. An ending that involved his own CEO, a full tank of jet fuel, and the keys to his entire kingdom. The air in the penthouse was different. It wasn't the recycled, climate-controlled air of their old two-bedroom apartment, which always smelled faintly of Lauren's oil paints and the burnt sugar from Connor's late-night creme brulee experiments. This air, 63 floors above the glittering sprawl of Austin, Texas, was thin, sterile, and smelled only of money and Windex. It was the smell of Connor's new life. Lauren Bishop stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, her hand resting protectively on the small, firm curve of her belly. 4 months. 4 months of carrying a secret that until tonight she had believed was a shared joy. Below the city was a river of light, a breathtaking vista of success. His success. Nexus Pay, the fintech startup they had poured their souls into, had gone public 6 months ago. They hadn't just become millionaires, they had catapulted into a stratosphere Lauren hadn't known existed. Connor Reeves, her Connor, the boy who used to patch his worn-out sneakers with duct tape, was now a billionaire. Their old life, the one built on shared dreams and ramen noodle dinners, had been packed away in boxes and stored in a facility somewhere in the city. A state-of-the-art climate-controlled facility, of course. Connor was meticulous about preserving assets. It seemed their history was now just another asset. He'd changed. It hadn't happened overnight. It was a slow erosion, a chipping away of the man she loved by the corrosive drip of wealth and adulation. First it was the clothes. His comfortable, worn-in flannels were replaced by bespoke suits from Savile Row that cost more than their first car. Then came the friends. Their old circle, the ones who had helped them move furniture and celebrated small victories with cheap beer, were gradually phased out, replaced by a flock of sleek, predatory socialites, venture capitalists with soulless eyes and aspiring influencers who laughed a little too loudly at Connor's jokes. Leading this new flock was Katrina Beaumont, a public relations guru whose specialty was sculpting the public image of the newly wealthy. With razor-sharp cheekbones and a voice like shattered ice, Katrina had convinced Connor that he wasn't just a CEO, he was a brand. And a brand needed to be curated. Lauren, with her love for quiet nights, her preference for worn paperbacks over glitzy galas, and her habit of wearing her heart on her sleeve, did not fit the brand. She heard the soft chime of the private elevator and turned. Connor stepped out, looking like he'd been carved from marble. His dark hair was perfectly coiffed, his Tom Ford suit immaculate. He was scrolling through his phone, his thumb moving with a relentless, twitchy energy. "Hey," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "I was waiting for you. I saved you some dinner." He didn't look up. "Had a tasting at Per Se with the Hamiltons. We're thinking of backing his new fusion restaurant. It's a branding play." He finally pocketed the phone, his eyes scanning the room, as if looking for a flaw. They settled on her. For a moment, a flicker of the old Connor seemed to surface, a hint of warmth. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You didn't go to the gallery opening with Katrina's group," he stated. It wasn't a question. "No, I wasn't feeling up to it," Lauren said, her hand instinctively going back to her belly. The morning sickness is more like all-day sickness lately. This was it. She had planned it all out. A quiet dinner, a bottle of sparkling cider for her, his favorite expensive scotch for him. She had the ultrasound photo tucked into a small silver frame hidden in the kitchen drawer. It was the perfect moment to tell him to bring them back to what was real, to what mattered. "You need to push through that, Lauren," he said, his tone clipped managerial. "These events are important. It's about visibility, presence. When you're not there, it creates a vacuum. People talk." A cold knot formed in her stomach. "What do they talk about, Connor?" He waved a dismissive hand, walking over to the vast minimalist bar. He poured himself a whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that we present a united front. The powerful, dynamic couple. It's the narrative Katrina is building." Lauren took a deep breath. "I have something to tell you. Something that's more important than narratives and branding." He took a sip of his drink, his back still to her. "If this is about the decor, I told you to let the interior designer handle it. I don't have the bandwidth for swatches and fabric samples." The cruelty of his indifference was a physical blow. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she willed them away. She would not cry. She walked over to the kitchen island, her movements feeling slow and heavy. She pulled the framed photo from the drawer and placed it on the marble countertop, turning it to face him. "We're having a baby, Connor." The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier and more suffocating than any argument they'd ever had. He didn't move. He just stood there, a silhouette against the city lights. Finally, he turned his face unreadable. He walked slowly toward the island and looked down at the grainy black-and-white image of a tiny comma-shaped being. Their child. Lauren held her breath, praying for a spark of joy for the man she married to reappear. He looked up from the photo, his eyes meeting hers. There was no joy. There was no warmth. There was only a chillingly calm, analytical froideur. "How far along are you?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. 14 weeks, she whispered, her heart starting to pound a painful, frantic rhythm against her ribs. He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting from her face around the vast, empty apartment, and then back to her. He saw her simple maternity dress, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face scrubbed clean of makeup. He saw the woman who had proofread his business plans, who had comforted him after failed investor meetings, who had believed in him when no one else did. And in his eyes, she saw his verdict. "Lauren," he began, and the sound of her name on his lips was like a death sentence. "We need to talk about the trajectory of my life, of our life." "Our life," she repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her. "You mean your life? I seem to be just a background character in it lately." "That's exactly the problem," he said, his voice dropping. It was the voice he used when he was about to fire someone. "The brand, the company, it's entering a new phase. It's global. It requires a certain aesthetic, a certain kind of partner. Someone who can command a room in Davos, who can charm a Saudi prince, who looks at home on the cover of a magazine." Every word was a perfectly aimed dart piercing through years of love and shared history. "And I'm not that woman," she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. He had the decency to look away, to stare out at his glittering kingdom below. "You were perfect for the man I was, Lauren. Truly." But I'm not that man anymore. He finally looked at her, his expression a mask of detached pity. You're a wonderful person, but you're too ordinary for where I'm going. Too ordinary. The words hung in the sterile air, sucking all the oxygen from the room. Ordinary. The woman carrying his child. The woman who knew he was terrified of thunderstorms and sang off key in the shower. The woman who held the copyright to his soul, or what was left of it. And the baby she managed to choke out. Is our child going to be too ordinary for you as well? Of course not, he said quickly, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. The child will be a Reeves. He or she will have every advantage. The best schools, the best connections. We'll handle this. My legal team will draw up a very, very generous arrangement. You'll be comfortable for the rest of your life. You won't have to worry about a thing. He was talking about their baby, their life as if it were a hostile takeover. A merger and acquisition. He wasn't dissolving a marriage. He was divesting from an underperforming asset. Lauren stared at him, the man she no longer recognized. The love she had felt for him curdled into something cold and hard in her chest. It was a strange, terrifying feeling, like watching a precious photograph burn to ash. In that moment, she wasn't just heartbroken. She was awake. The fog of her love for him, which had blinded her to the slow, creeping horror of his transformation, had finally lifted. She saw him clearly for the first time in months, a hollow man in a beautiful suit, rattling around in a gilded cage of his own making. I see, she said, her voice eerily calm. She picked up the ultrasound photo, her fingers tracing the silver frame. Thank you for your clarity, Connor. He seemed relieved by her composure. Good. I knew you'd be practical about this. It's for the best. For everyone. He turned to go back to his phone, his meetings, his branding plays. He thought the conversation was over. He thought she would meekly accept his generous arrangement and disappear. He had no idea that in the ashes of her heart, a plan was beginning to form. A plan that was anything but ordinary. She wouldn't just leave. She would make him understand what he had thrown away. And she wouldn't be doing it alone. She thought of the one other person who had seen the change in Connor. The one other person who had a stake in the real soul of Nexus Pay. A man who in a recent board meeting had looked at Connor's flashy, reckless proposals with an expression of deep concern. Daniel Cole, the CEO of Nexus Pay. Connor's right-hand man. And Lauren suddenly realized her only possible ally. For 2 days, Lauren existed in a state of suspended animation. She moved through the ridiculously large penthouse like a ghost. The city lights outside mocking her with their indifferent sparkle. Connor was barely there, engrossed in a whirlwind of meetings and calls about a new European expansion. He treated her with a detached professional courtesy, as if she were a departing employee serving out her notice period. He'd occasionally ask if she'd eaten or if she needed anything. The questions delivered with the same impersonal tone he used with the household staff. The generosity he had promised arrived in the form of an email from his personal lawyer, a man named Jeffrey Pike, with a name as sharp and bloodless as his prose. The email CC'd to Connor outlined the terms of a proposed separation agreement. It was, as Connor had promised, generous, a lump sum that would make her eyes water a year ago, a monthly stipend, a deed to a luxury condo in a respectable but not headline-grabbing part of the city. But then came the clauses buried in the legalese, a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that would gag her for life. and the custody section. It proposed a joint arrangement, but with stipulations that clearly paved the way for Connor to assume primary custody once the child was old enough for a nanny and a boarding school. It spoke of providing the child with a globally relevant upbringing, a phrase that sounded suspiciously like it had been penned by Katrina Beaumont herself. He wasn't just trying to erase her from his life. He was planning to eventually erase her from their child's life, too. That was the moment the ice in her veins turned to steel. Grief was a luxury she could no longer afford. She was now a mother fighting for her child. She thought back to Daniel Cole. Daniel was the operational genius Connor had brought in as CEO 2 years before the IPO. While Connor was the visionary, the public face Daniel was the one who made the trains run on time. He was older, perhaps in his late 40s, with a quiet, observant demeanor that stood in stark contrast to Connor's burgeoning flamboyance. Lauren had always liked him. He spoke to her as an equal, asking her opinion on design elements for the new office, remembering the name of her favorite author after she'd mentioned it once in passing. More importantly, she had seen the look in his eyes during recent company events. As Connor boasted about buying a sports team or commissioning a multi-million-dollar yacht, Lauren had caught Daniel's gaze. It was a look of profound disappointment, a quiet alarm that mirrored her own. Daniel wasn't one of Connor's new sycophants. He was a steward of the company they had all built. Finding his private number was a risk. It was stored in Connor's old phone, the one he'd discarded for the latest model. Lauren found it in a drawer of obsolete tech, a graveyard of his former life. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the contacts. Daniel C., private. It felt like a betrayal, a step into a world of corporate espionage she didn't understand. But what choice did she have? She dialed the number before she could lose her nerve. He answered on the second ring. Cole. His voice was crisp, professional. Daniel. It's Lauren. Lauren Bishop, Connor's wife. There was a pause. She could hear the faint sound of traffic in his background. He was probably in his car. Lauren, is everything all right? His tone shifted etantly, laced with genuine concern. No, it's not, she said, her voice cracking despite her best efforts. I need to talk to you. Urgently. And it has to be somewhere Connor will never find out about. Another pause, longer this time. She could imagine the calculations running through his head. The risk to his position, the implications of getting involved in his boss's domestic affairs. She was about to apologize to tell him to forget it when he spoke. There's a small coffee shop called The Daily Grind on 3rd and Brazos. It's old-fashioned, no one goes there. Can you be there in an hour? Yes, she said, relief washing over her. Thank you, Daniel. Be safe, Lauren, he said, and hung up. Lauren dressed carefully, choosing a simple, dark dress and a large scarf to cover her hair. She slipped out of the penthouse, using the service elevator, her heart pounding with every floor she descended. She took a regular taxi, a relic in her new world of private drivers, the scent of cheap air freshener, a strangely comforting anchor to reality. The Daily Grind was exactly as he'd described, a relic from another time, smelling of burnt coffee and old newspapers. Daniel was already there, tucked into a booth in the back corner. He stood up as she approached. In his simple chinos and a button-down shirt, he looked more like a college professor than the CEO of a billion-dollar company. Thank you for meeting me, she said, sliding into the booth. What's going on? He asked, his gaze direct and serious. She didn't hold back. The words tumbled out of her, the too ordinary speech, the cold, clinical way Connor had reacted to the pregnancy, the lawyer's email, the chilling custody clauses. She spoke of her fear, not just for herself, but for her baby, and for the man Connor had become. Daniel listened without interrupting his expression, growing more grim with every word. When she finally finished, she was breathless, emotionally spent. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "Lauren, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not entirely surprised." "You're not? I've seen the change in him," Daniel said, his voice low. "The IPO, it did something to him. He started listening to the wrong people. Katrina Beaumont has him convinced that image is more valuable than substance. He's making reckless financial decisions, pushing for vanity projects that have no real ROI. He wants to acquire a luxury fashion brand, for God's sake. We're a payment processing company." He sighed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "I've tried to counsel him to remind him of our core mission of the company we set out to build. He sees it as a lack of vision. He told me last week I was thinking too small." Now it was Lauren's turn to be unsurprised. Connor was shedding everyone who reminded him of his ordinary past, and that included the man who preached fiscal responsibility over flash. "The board is getting nervous," Daniel continued. "His erratic behavior, his spending, it's a liability. But he's the founder, the majority shareholder. His name is synonymous with the brand. Removing him would be corporate suicide. We're trapped." "I'm trapped too," Lauren whispered, her hand on her belly. "He'll use his money and power to crush me, Daniel. He'll paint me as an unstable gold digger and take my child." Daniel's eyes, which were usually a calm analytical grey, seemed to harden. "No, he won't." The conviction in his voice startled her. "How can you be so sure?" He looked around the dingy coffee shop, then leaned in closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Because we're not going to let him. You said you want to leave, to disappear, somewhere he can't find you, at least for a while. To get a head start, to build a case, to have your baby in peace." "Yes, that's exactly what I want." "Then that's what we'll do," Daniel said. "But leaving isn't enough. You need leverage. Something to stop him from coming after you with the full force of his legal army." What kind of leverage? Daniel's expression turned cunning, and for the first time, Lauren saw the shrewd strategist that had helped build Nexus Pay from the ground up. Connor's greatest strength is his public image, his brand. If we tarnish that, we wound him where he's most vulnerable. And his greatest asset, the one that gives him all his power, is the company jet. The Gulfstream G650. It was Connor's favorite toy, a gleaming silver dart that he used to shuttle his new friends to Aspen for ski weekends and to the Caribbean for impromptu parties. He'd named it the Nexus. The jet is registered as a corporate asset, Daniel explained. I, as CEO, have the authority to schedule it for company business. Emergency board meetings, site visits, investor relations. The justifications are endless. A slow, audacious idea began to dawn on Lauren. You mean, he's hosting the Innovators Gala at the Penthouse on Friday night? Daniel said, a small, grim smile playing on his lips. He'll be distracted, surrounded by 100 of his new best friends. The jet is scheduled to be on standby at the Austin Executive Airport for a potential trip to Zurich on Saturday morning. A trip I know he's not taking. He leaned back, watching her reaction. I could be called away for an urgent company matter. I could need to fly out immediately, and I could, for security and support, require a trusted consultant to come with me. Lauren's heart was hammering against her ribs. But this time, it wasn't from fear. It was from a wild, terrifying thrill. This was insane. It was audacious. It was perfect. It wasn't just an escape. It was a statement. Taking the ultimate symbol of his new life with the help of his own CEO. He would be furious, Lauren breathed. He would be apoplectic, Daniel corrected her. He would be publicly humiliated. Connor Reeves, the man who controls everything, can't even control his own plane. It would create exactly the kind of chaos and doubt we need. It would give you time, and it would give me leverage with the board. It would force them to see how unstable he's become. Where would we go? I have a house on the coast of Oregon. It's quiet, private, and under a different holding company name. No one would ever think to look for you there. It's the perfect place to lie low and plan your next move. I've already got a name for you. The best family law attorney in the state. Audrey Kane. She eats men like Connor for breakfast. Lauren looked at Daniel, truly looked at him. He wasn't just helping her. This was a coup planned with the precision of a military operation. Her personal crisis was the catalyst he needed to protect the company. They both cared about the company Connor was driving into the ground. Their goals were aligned. "Why are you doing this, Daniel?" she asked quietly. "It's a huge risk for you." He met her gaze, and his expression softened. "Because I remember the early days. I remember Connor talking about changing the world of finance for the little guy. I remember you sitting in our crappy little office, designing the user interface because we couldn't afford a graphic designer making it simple and accessible for everyone. You were the original nexus of Nexus Pay, Lauren. You represent the soul of this company." He's forgotten that. I haven't. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were tears of gratitude. She wasn't alone. She had an ally, a powerful one. "Okay," she said, her voice firm, resolute. "Let's do it. Let's take the jet." The night of the Innovators Gala, the penthouse was transformed into a parody of sophistication. Ice sculptures dripped onto priceless rugs. A string quartet soared away in a corner, drowned out by the braying laughter of Connor's guests, and the air was thick with expensive perfume and ambition. Lauren watched the proceedings from the doorway of their master suite, a silent observer in her own home. She had claimed a sudden debilitating migraine, an excuse Connor accepted with transparent relief. Her ordinary presence would have only diluted the high-gloss finish of his perfect evening. He was in his element, a champagne flute in one hand, the other gesturing expansively as he held court. Katrina Beaumont was glued to his side, her red dress a slash of crimson against the sea of black tuxedos. They looked like a king and his consort surveying their court. The sight no longer pained Lauren. It fueled her. At 9:45 p.m., she received a text. A single word from a number she didn't recognize. Now. It was the signal from Daniel. Her bag was already packed. It was a simple leather duffel, the one she'd used for weekend trips in their old life. Inside, there was no designer clothing or jewelry. She had packed 3 changes of simple, comfortable clothes, a copy of her favorite book, East of Eden, the framed ultrasound photo, and a small, worn-out photo album. The album was filled with pictures of her and Connor from before. Before the money, before the penthouse, before the hollowness had taken root in his eyes. It was her evidence, her reminder of what was real. Lastly, she packed the old discarded phone of Connor's, the one with Daniel's number. It felt like a crucial piece of the puzzle. She took one last look around the opulent bedroom. The cavernous walk-in closet was filled with clothes and shoes he'd bought for her, all of them beautiful, all of them feeling like a costume. She left them all behind. She walked over to the jewelry box on her dresser, a gift from him. Inside, nestled amongst diamonds and platinum, was the simple silver locket he had given her on their first anniversary. She opened it. On one side was a picture of them laughing on a park bench. On the other side, an inscription, "My anchor." She closed the locket, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She didn't take it with her. She left it open on the pillow of his perfectly made bed. A final silent message. You cut the rope. Slipping out was easier than she'd imagined. The service elevator was deserted, the staff all busy catering to the gala. The cool night air hit her as she exited through a discreet side door, a welcome shock after the stifling atmosphere upstairs. A black sedan with tinted windows was waiting at the curb exactly as Daniel had described. The driver, a large man with a calm, professional demeanor, simply nodded as she approached, taking her bag and opening the door for her. He didn't ask her name. To the executive airport, ma'am, he said, his voice a low rumble. The drive was a blur of neon and shadows. Lauren's mind raced. What if Connor noticed she was gone? What if someone saw her? What if this was all a terrible mistake? She clutched the ultrasound photo through the canvas of her bag, the image of her child, a talisman against her fear. They bypassed the main terminal, pulling up to the discreet entrance of the private hangars. And there it was, the Gulfstream G650. The Nexus. It gleamed under the floodlights, a potent symbol of everything she was leaving behind, and simultaneously her chariot of liberation. The engines were already whining a low hum of power that vibrated through the soles of her feet. The sedan door opened, and Daniel Cole was there. Dressed in dark, practical travel clothes, he looked calm and resolute. He offered her a hand to help her out of the car. You made it, he said, his smile reassuring. Ready? As I'll ever be, she replied, her voice shaky. He led her up the short flight of stairs into the jet's cabin. The interior was Connor's design, all cream leather, polished chrome, and dark mahogany. It was the pinnacle of sterile luxury. A flight attendant, a woman with a professional, unquestioning smile, offered her a drink. Lauren asked for water. The pilot has filed our flight plan for Portland, Daniel said, settling into the seat across from her. It's logged as an emergency consultation with our West Coast server infrastructure team. Plausible and incredibly boring. No one will question it tonight. Just as Lauren began to feel a sliver of safety, a wave of relief. Daniel's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and the color drained from his face. What is it? Lauren asked, her stomach lurching. It's a text from Connor's assistant, he said, his voice tight. She says Connor wants the jet ready. He's planning an impromptu trip to Vegas with a few guests after the party. He's on his way here. Now. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Lauren. He was coming. Of course he was. His perfect night, his perfect plan for a celebratory jaunt to Vegas. She was about to ruin it. He would find them. He would find her. What do we do? She whispered, her eyes wide with terror. He'll see me. It's over. Daniel's face was a mask of intense concentration. He looked out the window toward the gate that led to the tarmac. Then he looked at the pilot who was visible in the cockpit, going through the final pre-flight checks. He made a decision. It's not over, he said, his voice regaining its command. He pressed the intercom button. Captain, this is Mr. Cole. We have a change of plans. The situation is more critical than we thought. We need to take off immediately. I am invoking executive priority. Acknowledge. A calm voice crackled back. Acknowledged, Mr. Cole. Commencing final preparations for immediate departure. Daniel turned back to Lauren. Buckle up. Tightly. He was on his phone typing a rapid-fire message. I'm messaging the head of airport security, a man who owes me a favor. I'm telling him Connor Reeves's access card has been flagged for a potential security breach and to deny him tarmac access until it's cleared by me personally. It'll buy us a few minutes. The jet began to move, taxiing away from the hangar with a smooth, powerful surge. Lauren gripped her armrests, her knuckles white. She stared out the window, her heart in her throat. And then she saw it. A black Escalade Connor's car, speeding toward Desturus the gate. It screeched to a halt. The door was flung open, and Connor stormed out, his face a thunderous mask of fury. He was shouting at the security guard at the gate, stabbing a finger toward their departing plane. Even from a distance, she could see his rage. The guard stood firm, shaking his head, holding up a hand. Connor was being denied, blocked from his own kingdom. The jet swung onto the main runway. The pitch of the engines rose to a deafening roar. Lauren felt a tremendous force push her back into the plush leather seat as the plane accelerated. Faster and faster the runway lights, streaking past into a blur of white and blue. And then, with a feeling of impossible lightness, they were airborne. The plane banked sharply, and Lauren looked down. She could see the entire city spread out below her, a carpet of diamonds. She could see the flashing lights of the Escalade at the gate of the airfield. She could see the tiny, furious figure of her husband growing smaller and smaller until he was just another insignificant speck in the glittering metropolis he so desperately wanted to own. Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't tears of sorrow or fear anymore. They were tears of pure, unadulterated release. She was out. She was free. She looked across at Daniel, who was watching her with a quiet, steady gaze. He gave her a small, solemn nod. They flew on in silence, climbing higher and higher, leaving the life that was no longer hers far below. Lauren leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, her hand resting on her belly. For the first time in a long time, she felt a profound sense of peace. She wasn't just escaping. She was ascending. Connor Reeves stood on the tarmac, a solitary figure, dwarfed by the cavernous expanse of the private airfield. The sound of the Gulfstream's engines, a roar he had always associated with his own ascent, now felt like a personal mockery. Each decibel was a note in a symphony of betrayal, a thunderous announcement of his own staggering ineptitude. He watched the navigation lights of his jet blink once, twice, before being swallowed by the vast, indifferent blackness of the Texas sky. Gone. For a full, breathless minute, he was paralyzed by a disbelief so profound it felt like a physical impact winding him. The security guard, a man named George, whose family's Christmas card was probably on his assistant's desk, was stammering about a security flag and CEO priority protocol. The words were meaningless static. The reality was a clean, sharp, impossible truth, Lauren. His quiet, predictable, ordinary Lauren had just hijacked his life's most potent symbol and vanished. And she hadn't acted alone. The text from his assistant, which he now read for the 10th time, burned on his screen. Mr. Cole boarded the Nexus 10 minutes ago with an unidentified female guest. Destination, Portland. Daniel Cole, his loyal, plodding CEO. The man he'd hired to handle the boring minutiae so he could focus on the grand vision. The betrayal wasn't just audacious. It was illogical, a tear in the fabric of the world he had so meticulously constructed. The rage, when it finally broke through the shock, was not hot and explosive, but a glacial, terrifyingly clear fury. This was not a domestic squabble. This was a declaration of war. He stormed back to the escalade, leaving the babbling guard behind. He jabbed at his phone, his fingers trembling with a rage that demanded an outlet. "Get Pike on the line!" Now he barked at his assistant through the car's speakerphone. The connection was made instantly. "Connor, what's going on?" The party is over," Connor snarled. "Pike, listen to me very carefully. My wife and Daniel Cole have stolen my jet." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Jeffrey Pike, a lawyer who dealt in hostile takeovers and patent litigation, was not accustomed to calls about stolen jets. Connor slowed down. "Stolen is a legally specific term. Daniel is the CEO. He has operational authority to command corporate assets. Don't you dare quote bylaws at me, Jeffrey," Connor roared, the sound echoing in the leather-lined interior of the car. "He took my wife, who is in the process of leaving me on my plane in the middle of the night under false pretenses. That is theft, that is kidnapping. I want them arrested. I want the FAA to ground that plane. I want his career reduced to a smoking crater before he even touches down." "And what do we tell the FAA, Connor?" Pike's voice was calm. A maddening counterpoint to Connor's frenzy. "That your CEO and your wife are flying to Portland. They'll ask if a crime has been committed. If you say yes, you'll be admitting to the world that you have zero control over your own C-suite. The story will be that the founder of Nexus Pay is so erratic, his own CEO had to spirit his wife to safety. The stock will open in a freefall. Is that the outcome you want?" Pike's logic was infuriating and impeccable. He was right. Daniel had built a cage of plausible deniability. To accuse him publicly was to immolate himself. The walls of his world, which had seemed so high and impenetrable, now felt like they were shrinking, pressing in on him. When he burst back into the penthouse, the dissonance was jarring. The string quartet was playing something light and forgettable, and the air was cloying with the scent of lilies and champagne. Katrina, a vision in crimson, glided toward him, her smile bright with manufactured delight. "Connor, darling, we were about to mutiny. A few of us are packed and ready for round 2 in Vegas." He looked past her at the sea of smiling, vacuous faces, the venture capitalists, the influencers, the social climbers. They were parasites, and he had willingly invited them to feed on him. His gaze was cold reptilian. "The trip's off," he snapped, his voice a low command that sliced through the chatter. "Everyone needs to leave. The party is over. Now." The effect was instantaneous. Laughter died in throats. The music faltered into a discordant scrape. Anxious glances were exchanged. Within 15 minutes, the penthouse was empty. A battlefield of abandoned glasses and crushed canapes. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning. It was in this tomb-like quiet, wandering through the wreckage of his perfect evening, that he walked into the master suite. There, on the vast, empty expanse of his perfectly made bed, sat the open silver locket. He picked it up. The tiny picture of them, young and laughing, seemed to mock him from a forgotten era. And the inscription, "My anchor," felt less like a memory and more like a diagnosis. An anchor is what holds you in place. He had wanted to soar untethered. He had cut the rope himself. The flicker of self-awareness was agonizing a glimpse into an abyss of his own making. He quickly smothered it, transmuting the pain back into pure, cleansing rage. She would pay for this. They both would. At 3 a.m., sitting alone in his glass-walled office, overlooking the sleeping city, he drafted the email. It was a masterpiece of corporate brutality, announcing Daniel Cole's immediate termination for gross misconduct, corporate espionage, and theft of assets. He sent it to the entire board of directors, a digital guillotine he was certain would end the rebellion. Then he sat back and waited for the affirmations of loyalty to pour in. Thousands of miles away, the Gulfstream's wheels touched down on a private mist-shrouded runway on the Oregon coast. The moment the cabin door opened, Lauren was met not with the recycled air of her gilded cage, but with a cool, cleansing breeze that smelled of salt pine and damp earth. It was the smell of life, and she inhaled it like a drowning woman taking her first breath. A discreet sedan drove them to a house nestled in a secluded cove. It wasn't a monument to wealth like the penthouse. It was a home, a structure of warm cedar and vast panes of glass that didn't seek to dominate the landscape, but to become a part of it. Inside, a fire was already crackling in a stone hearth. "This is beautiful," Lauren breathed, running a hand along a worn wooden mantelpiece. "It's my sanctuary," Daniel said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "My grandparents built a small cabin on this land. I replaced it with this, but I tried to keep the feeling." "You're safe here, Lauren." Completely off the grid. That first night after Daniel showed her to a guest room with a window that looked directly out onto the churning Pacific, Lauren unpacked her small duffel bag. She placed the ultrasound photo on the bedside table. Then she took out the worn photo album and sat on the edge of the bed. She slowly turned the pages, looking at the images of the boy she'd loved, the boy with the goofy grin and the patched-up sneakers, the boy who had held her hand at her father's funeral, the boy who had whispered his dreams to her in the dark. It wasn't an act of mourning. It was an act of arming herself. This was her proof. This was her truth. For the first time in months, she slept a deep, dreamless sleep, the sound of the ocean, a steady, protective lullaby. The next morning, Daniel was already at work, his laptop open on a large oak table. He looked up as she entered. Connor made his move. He said, his tone grimly satisfied. "He tried to fire me via a 3 a.m. email to the board." "Can he do that?" Lauren asked, her heart sinking. "He could, if he were dealing with an amateur," Daniel replied. "But my employment contract has a poison pill clause against summary termination. The board is legally obligated to launch a formal investigation, and they're spooked. They've called an emergency meeting for Friday." He slid his laptop around. "This is what I've been preparing." It was a dossier, a meticulously compiled file detailing Connor's increasingly erratic behavior, the reckless spending, the vanity projects, and now this unhinged reaction. Daniel was not just defending himself, he was building an unassailable case for a change in leadership. Later that day, Lauren met Audrey Kane. The attorney arrived not in a flashy car, but a practical Subaru, her demeanor all business. She sat with Lauren at the oak table, the fire crackling beside them, and listened to the entire story. When Lauren slid the separation agreement from Connor's lawyer across the table, Audrey scanned it, her lips tightening into a thin line. "This," she said, tossing the papers aside as if they were contaminated, "is an intimidation tactic, not a legal document. It's a classic move by a bully. He thinks because he has more money, he has more power. In my courtroom, Ms. Bishop, facts have power, and we are going to arm you with an arsenal of them." For 2 hours, Audrey laid out the strategy. It wasn't just about divorce and custody. "We will argue that your intellectual and emotional labor was a foundational component of Nexus Pay's success. The user interface you designed, the business plans you proofread. That wasn't a wife helping out. That was sweat equity. You weren't just his anchor, you were his partner. He will not be divorcing a homemaker. He will be separating from an uncredited co-founder, and we will demand a settlement that reflects that truth." Lauren felt a shift inside her. The last vestiges of the victim she had felt herself to be were burning away in the fire of Audrey Kane's righteous conviction. She was not a woman who had been left. She was a woman who had been wronged, and she was about to fight back. The emergency board meeting took place via secure video conference on Friday. Connor appeared from his penthouse office, framed by the Austin skyline, his suit immaculate, his face a mask of controlled fury. Daniel was in the Nexus Pay headquarters, calm and composed. One by one, the faces of the board members blinked into existence, a gallery of serious, worried expressions. Connor launched into his tirade, his voice dripping with venom. He spoke of loyalty and treason, of Daniel's manipulative influence on his emotionally fragile wife. He painted a picture of a corporate coup born from a domestic dispute, a narrative designed to make the board feel they were choosing between their founder and a meddling subordinate. When he finished, an uncomfortable silence filled the virtual room. Then Daniel spoke, his voice calm and measured. He didn't rebut the accusations directly. Instead, he shared his screen, presenting a slide deck filled with facts and figures, the disastrous ROI on the vanity projects, the stock analysts' concerns over Connor's recent public statements, the internal polling showing a decline in employee morale. He was dispassionately dissecting Connor's leadership brick by brick. "This isn't about a personal matter," Daniel concluded. "This is about a pattern of erratic behavior and fiscal irresponsibility that poses an existential threat to this company. My actions were an extreme measure to protect shareholder value and corporate stability." Then Robert Chen, the lead director, cleared his throat. "We have one other party who has requested to speak." A new window popped into the conference. Lauren. She was not where Connor expected her to be. Not in a hotel room or some anonymous apartment. She was in a warm, light-filled room, a roaring fire visible behind her. She looked serene, healthy, and unshakably calm. Connor's composure finally cracked. The sight of her so clearly thriving outside of his orbit was an unbearable insult. "What is this?" he sputtered. "She has no place here." Lauren looked directly into the camera, her gaze finding Connor's on the screen. She saw the rage, the confusion, the crumbling facade of the Titan. She felt no pity. She felt only a quiet, resolute strength. "Connor," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the tension. "You told me I was too ordinary for your new life. You tried to erase me from our shared history and from our child's future." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle on the silent board members. "You underestimated me. And you underestimated the soul of the company you built. It was never just about you." Her presence, her composure, her quiet power did more damage than any shouting match could have. She wasn't the unstable woman he'd described. She was the picture of rational grace. In that moment, the board saw the truth. The chaos, the instability, the liability. It all originated from one source, their founder. The fallout was swift and bloodless. The board voted unanimously to invoke a key person clause for an incapacitated executive. Connor Reeves was transitioned to the newly created non-operational role of founder and chief visionary. He kept his fortune, but was stripped of all authority. Daniel Cole was named chairman of the board, cementing his control. Connor sat in his glass box, stunned into silence, a king in a castle with no power, listening as the drawbridge was pulled up and he was locked inside. Audrey Kane's settlement was a masterpiece. Lauren received a share of assets that reflected her foundational role in the company, ensuring her and her child's future. More importantly, she was granted sole legal and physical custody. The king could have his kingdom. She had her child. 6 months later, the Oregon house was hers, purchased from Daniel. She sat in a rocking chair in a nursery, filled with the scent of lavender and baby powder. In her arms, she held her daughter asleep on her chest. She had named her Hope. She looked out the window at the vast, wild ocean, a view that once represented a desperate escape, but was now the backdrop to her peace. She had been deemed ordinary, a footnote in a great man's story. But she had learned that true strength was not in the noise you make, but in the quiet, unyielding conviction of your own worth. She had written her own ending, and it was more extraordinary than any life Connor could have ever imagined. In the end, it wasn't about the money, the jet, or the corporate power play. It was about a woman reclaiming her story. Lauren proved that being ordinary, being grounded, being loyal, being decent isn't a weakness. It's a superpower, especially in a world that has lost its way. She didn't just escape a bad marriage. She orchestrated a revolution, saving not only herself and her child, but the soul of a company. Her story is a powerful reminder that your worth is never determined by someone else's valuation. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one with the most power, waiting for the right moment to change the world. What did you think of Lauren's incredible story of courage and clever revenge? Let us know in the comments below. If you were moved by her journey, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories of justice and empowerment.